Hi, I'm Brian Katsoulis. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Middle East Institute. I want to thank all of you for joining us for what I think will be a very interesting hour-long discussion about the broader trends in extremism and terrorism. The genesis for this discussion was a report that I received in a briefing about 2 months ago when I was in Rome. I happened to be in Rome on my way back from the Middle East right after the war between Hamas and Israel broke out with Hamas's attack. And I had the pleasure of meeting the report's author, whom I'll introduce along with the panel in a second, who briefed me on the subject of his report, The Silent Enemy, which you can find a link to in the events page at the Middle East Institute's webpage. And I thought it was a really interesting argument that Andrea Manciulli made in his report. A report I want to highlight was written before the war between Israel and Hamas, this latest war. He was describing broader trends, and I thought it was important to, from time to time, take a step back and look at the bigger picture and ask the question, where are things going in the trends in extremism and terrorism? And this report, I think, does a very important job outlining that. So what we're going to do today, after I introduce the panel and give a bit of instruction about the interpretation, because we're in a bilingual event, we're going to hear from the report's author, and then we're going to hear from 3 experts who've looked at this issue from different angles and have a discussion for about an hour. First, let me introduce Andrea Manciulli, who is the Director of International Relations of the Med-Or Leonardo Foundation, which is the organization that's co-hosting and co-sponsoring this event with the Middle East Institute. He's had a long experience looking at the challenges of terrorism, national security, and international politics in European defense, and has served in his government as well as being a noted analyst and academic. After Andrea, we'll hear from my colleague, Charles Lister, who directs MEI's programs on counterterrorism in Syria and has tracked not just the issue of the Syria civil war and the impact that terrorism has there, but has examined the broader trends and has a lot to say about that. Third, we'll turn to Emily Blount, who is a senior research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Is the author of a very recent book on Iran and has written with us at the Liberal Patriot some interesting analyses on the effect of extremist and terrorist ideology and propaganda on debates here in the United States. And lastly, we'll turn to Lorenzo Vino, who's the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. Just before I turn to Andrea, just a brief note on the bilingual nature of this event. If you're joining and you don't speak English, or if you don't speak Italian, we have an interpreter. And if you're on Zoom, as we all are, but if you're on your laptop, you'll see a little button at the bottom that should indicate interpretation. You can switch that to English. If you're on your iPad, like you are with me, I am, just go to the More section of your iPad, like I just did here, press on it, and then Interpretation, and you can choose English or Italian. That's the way you do it. So without further ado, because we only have about 60 minutes for the whole conversation, I'd like to turn it to Andrea for his remarks on this report, on the bigger picture, just to kick off the discussion. And thank you again for doing this.
Buona serata a tutti. Innanzitutto grazie di questa occasione, è un'occasione molto importante per Med-Or e anche per me che ho scritto questo rapporto, è anche l'occasione per vedere amici, diciamo, e trovarci con amici insieme. Questo rapporto noi lo abbiamo pensato 1 anno fa, e quando lo abbiamo pensato lo abbiamo intitolato Il nemico silente, perché ritenevamo che in Europa e anche nel nostro paese, in Italia, ci fosse una crescente sottovalutazione della minaccia del terrorismo. Noi abbiamo vissuto epoche di grande attenzione sul fenomeno del terrorismo, nelle quali io, fra le altre cose, dirigevo in Parlamento tutta la legislazione che si è occupata del terrorismo in Italia, e nello stesso tempo ero anche il capo della delegazione italiana all'Assemblea della NATO, nella quale ero il titolare del rapporto sul terrorismo di matrice jihadista. Erano gli anni del Bataclan e in Europa c'era un'attenzione molto diffusa e importante su questo fenomeno. Però piano piano le preoccupazioni di altri scenari, non ultima la guerra in Ucraina, e anche altre crisi nel Mediterraneo, avevano progressivamente fatto sfumare l'attenzione sul fenomeno terrorismo. E questo, diciamo, per me e per il presidente della Fondazione Medor, Marco Minniti, che è stato ministro degli interni e anche capo, autorità delegata dei servizi italiani, era ed è una grande sottovalutazione. Per questo abbiamo deciso di scrivere questo rapporto. E, ironia della sorte, lo abbiamo presentato il 5 di ottobre, solo 2 giorni prima dell'attacco di Hamas a Israele. Dico ironia della sorte perché proprio 2 giorni dopo si è verificato quello che non esattamente, ma che immaginavamo potesse accadere, cioè che alla fine si potesse produrre un attacco terroristico anche, diciamo, su larga scala, che fosse insieme pratico, strategico e comunicativo. Questa vicenda e la sovrapposizione degli eventi ha fatto sì che questo rapporto nel nostro paese ha avuto una certa eco. E questo è un problema, perché uno dei problemi del terrorismo in Europa è che ce ne occupiamo soltanto quando si accendono i riflettori, c'è un attentato, c'è un episodio, per poi piombare nell'anonimato e nell'eclissi, e questo è il vero problema. Questo rapporto è un rapporto che cerca di prendere il fenomeno nella sua ampiezza. Io, per formazione, nella mia vita accademica, sono uno storico militare di formazione annalista. Uno dei grandi esponenti della storiografia delle annali ha elaborato l'idea della lunga durata, e uno dei problemi di analisi verso il terrorismo è proprio quello che spesso l'analisi sul terrorismo è molto fattuale, puntuale, in occasione di un evento, e assai raramente si dà al terrorismo quell'ampiezza temporale che invece meriterebbe. Questo rapporto, nella sua forma divulgativa, perché è un rapporto che possono leggere tutti, lo abbiamo fatto perché lo possono leggere tutti, noi lo abbiamo voluto distribuire in tutti i consessi accademici, ma anche nelle scuole, anche, diciamo, su un pubblico di più larga scala. Vuole invece spiegare come il tema della minaccia jihadista è un tema di lunga durata e la cui minaccia noi non possiamo considerare un pezzo alla volta, e che anche quando scompare la minaccia del terrorismo finisce per essere invece una minaccia della quale bisogna occuparci con grande serietà. Quali sono i punti fondamentali di questo rapporto? Questo rapporto, e comincio dalla fine perché è poi il cuore, questo rapporto dice che l'Europa sarà l'epicentro della nuova crisi del terrorismo. Anzi, definisce l'Europa il palcoscenico naturale del terrorismo, perché l'Europa si trova al centro in questo momento di diverse contraddizioni. Quelle geopolitiche, non si può non constatare che le 2 più grandi crisi in questo momento dal punto di vista bellico siano entrambe ai confini dell'Europa, perché la vicenda ucraina, che va avanti da qualche anno, è una vicenda che sta al confine est dell'Europa. Le vicende del Mediterraneo e della nuova guerra fra Hamas e Israele stanno al confine sud del Mediterraneo, così come il Sahel e una parte, diciamo, dell'Africa che in questi anni ha conosciuto 8 colpi di Stato. Da questa parte del mondo viene la grande crisi migratoria che sta riguardando l'Europa e, come avrete visto e avrete constatato, ha fortemente caratterizzato la politica e le elezioni in molti paesi europei membri della NATO, non ultimo le elezioni in Olanda che si sono svolte, paese caro al mio amico Lorenzo Vidino, nel quale ha anche abitato e che ha visto proprio nelle ultime settimane un'affermazione della destra proprio sui temi dell'immigrazione, della paura che viene dall'altra sponda del Mediterraneo. L'Europa quindi è in questo rapporto il palcoscenico del terrorismo. Perché noi siamo particolarmente preoccupati? Perché ci sono 2 grandi realtà di preoccupazione. Quella più vicina all'Italia, che è fortemente interconnessa con le vicende dell'immigrazione, è l'area del Sahel e dell'Africa subsahariana. Perché questa è stata negli ultimi anni la zona nella quale si sono verificate due fenomeni entrambi preoccupanti. Una forte crescita del terrorismo dovuta al cambiamento climatico e alla difficoltà alimentare crescente di sempre più popolazioni. Il lago Chad, che è stato da sempre il fulcro dell'economia di quest'area, è quasi completamente prosciugato e popolazioni che vivevano in qualche maniera di una pastorizia nomadica da secoli sono finite in una soglia molto al di sotto della povertà. Questo ha fatto sì che una fortissima economia illegale ha cominciato a sostituire l'economia materiale e il terrorismo è diventata l'intercapedine di protezione che si alimenta da questa economia illegale. È un'economia che ha 2 fattori. Uno, favorisce l'immigrazione verso l'Europa, la organizza perché è diventata una fonte di reddito e nello stesso tempo finanzia attraverso queste forme di traffico, che non è solo un traffico di migranti, ma è anche traffico di stupefacenti che arriva dall'America del Sud e negli Stati Uniti questo fenomeno è estremamente noto, alle coste della Mauritania e attraverso il Sahel, transitando dal deserto, arriva tramite i Balcani in Europa e alimenta una forma di illegalità diffusa, della quale il terrorismo si nutre. Si sono molto mischiati questi fenomeni e questa è una preoccupazione molto disconosciuta nel mondo atlantico e in generale. E credo che questo rapporto possa dare un contributo a favorire questa discussione, perché questa, a mio avviso, sarà uno dei grossi problemi di insicurezza che la NATO dovrà fronteggiare. L'endemizzazione del terrorismo di fronte alle coste dell'Europa, perché il terrorismo si mischia con varie forme di illegalità e diventa una risposta negativa a una difficoltà economica e sociale molto forte. È evidente che quello che è accaduto in Israele, l'offensiva di Hamas, la rinascita di un proselitismo jihadista molto forte che ha come immagine nel cuore la Palestina, finirà per alimentare ancora di più il jihadismo del Nord Africa e del Sahel. E quindi questi fenomeni sono destinati a sommarsi e a ampliarsi. Del resto, come abbiamo visto anche nei giorni scorsi a Parigi, a Arras e a Bruxelles, subito dopo l'attacco di Hamas, l'effervescenza sia del jihadismo mediatico e comunicativo che di quello materiale è stata estremamente evidente. L'altro fenomeno estremamente preoccupante, mi avvio a concludere, che il rapporto analizza, è invece la minaccia del terrorismo che viene dall'Asia e che attraverso il Caucaso e i Balcani arriva ugualmente all'Europa. C'è un jihadismo crescente, lo abbiamo visto, nelle ex repubbliche sovietiche asiatiche. C'è un jihadismo crescente nelle zone del Caucaso e purtroppo grazie alla crescita del mercato anomalo delle armi dovuto alla guerra in Ucraina, stanno attivandosi molto le cellule europee di origine cecena. Non bisogna dimenticare che l'attentatore di Arrah era di origine cecena. Non bisogna dimenticare che gli ultimi attentati avuti in Europa, per esempio ho in testa quello di Vienna, era stato fatto con armi che venivano dai ceceni attraverso i Balcani. C'è una crescita forte della radicalizzazione e dei fenomeni di infiltrazione di cellule terroriste e anche di singoli che viene attraverso il Caucaso e i Balcani. Questo è un fenomeno del quale abbiamo discusso molte volte con Lorenzo Vidino, che è ancora troppo trascurato. L'Italia sa bene che questa è, per esempio, per noi la più grossa minaccia. Nelle settimane scorse, dopo la vicenda dell'attacco di Hamas, la cosa più tangibile antiterrorismo fatta in Italia è stata sospendere l'accordo di Schengen con la Slovenia, al confine con la Slovenia, perché la rotta balcanica era quella più sotto traccia e più importante per possibili attacchi che riguardavano il nostro paese. I due più grossi arresti fatti negli ultimi anni in Italia, quello di Safet Krasniqi e Bilal Bosnic, due predicatori che facevano reclutamento per Daesh nel nostro paese, venivano dai Balcani. C'è quindi una enorme priorità Balcani. Ecco, e chiudo. Voi capite che se le mettiamo insieme queste due cose, il Nord Africa e i Balcani, la NATO viene chiamata in causa immediatamente, perché sono anche i due luoghi nelle quali la NATO negli ultimi decenni è stata chiamata ad operare. La guerra della ex Jugoslavia, da una parte, e il jihadismo nei Balcani si nutre di questa vicenda, nella sua capacità evocativa, anche con la forza dei russi che in qualche maniera hanno alimentato un'identità serba in antitesi alla presenza musulmana in quello scenario, e dall'altra parte la vicenda libica, l'abbattimento di Gheddafi e nello stesso tempo la minaccia del Sahel. Cioè, noi siamo chiamati in causa e questo rapporto non vuole essere un triste profeta, vuole essere invece un nuovo ponte transatlantico perché questa minaccia diventi comune e venga usata per rafforzare la NATO su un nuovo versante che è meglio prevenire piuttosto che curare una volta che è scoppiato. Io devo dire che il presidente Biden sta facendo un lavoro incredibile sulla vicenda israeliana, con grande generosità. È l'Europa che manca di più e il nostro rapporto finisce proprio con una grande esortazione all'Europa, perché l'Europa non può pensare di essere spettatrice rispetto al fatto che le due più grosse crisi in atto sono ai suoi confini. Ci vuole un nuovo protagonismo dell'Europa che deve su questo rilanciare e contribuire a rilanciare la NATO e una prospettiva transatlantica.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea, and thanks not only for your rich comments here, but a very interesting report. And I'm going to turn to our other colleagues here. This is the portion where maybe if we're like doctors trying to diagnose, we offer diagnosis and whether we agree or disagree with Andrea's diagnosis, and then maybe turn to any prescriptions too as well. I know we only have a few minutes, but Charles, Andrea argues that the problem has been overlooked in recent years, the problem of terrorism. It's a problem that Europe is the epicenter, or will be the epicenter for, facing pressure both from the East and from the South. I know you've done work for years on the challenge of Syria and have looked at this and the impact that Syria has had on Europe as well. How do you see, what's your reaction to the report and Andrea's comments? And then what sort of thoughts do you have about how America is handling these issues in the big picture?
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thank you, Andrea, for your very interesting report. I think it is very insightful. I agree with the big picture findings or concerns about terrorism being overlooked. It's treated, certainly in the United States, as kind of an old issue, that it's something that's passed by. It was resolved several years ago with the territorial defeat of ISIS, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now we can move on to other things. And I have long been saying that was very misleading and frankly a bit dangerous. So I very much agree with the big picture concerns. One sort of brief comment on the silent enemy title. Silent, if silence means a relative lack of action, of attacks. Not so silent if you're listening to the groups themselves. If anything, they are as loud as they've always been, but they are often talking and planning and positing ideas in directions that they weren't necessarily thinking of 5 or 10 years ago, which would have grabbed our attention much more immediately. And I do think that's also a problem. And I'll come to talk about this in a little bit, but what grabs our attention is I think part of the problem and part of the reason why it's dropped off the policymaking radar. A few sort of short, specific granular sort of reflections on some of the comments in the report. I think on the section that talks about Al-Qaeda, I think very rightly, Andrea, you highlight the differences between bin Laden and Zawahiri, highlighting issues like increasing or decreasing favor of the gradualist approach. I think all of that is very right. There was certainly an evolution within Al-Qaeda and its thinking, although I also think to an extent it's also a bit more complicated. I think Zawahiri in particular proved himself to be quite inconsistent and indecisive as a leadership figure. From 2010 to roughly 2014 or 2015, Zawahiri was wholly supportive of Al-Qaeda being a kind of localist, decentralized, quote unquote, pragmatic, and gradualist movement. He wholly embraced that idea, which was relatively new from Al-Qaeda and certainly different than how bin Laden had tried to orient Al-Qaeda. But basically, that approach meant that his power reduced with time. He lost control of his affiliates in multiple areas around the world. And so he pivoted back to the old style approach. And that actually, I think, further degraded the extent to which he was able to control his movement rather than necessarily an organization. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that in terms of a counterterrorism approach. Now we find ourselves in a situation where Saif al-Adil is thought to be the new leader, although there is still some debate within government about whether or not that is the case. Hamza al-Ghamdi, who is in Afghanistan, is also considered to have been a potential successor. But whoever it is, they have an enormous task on their hands if re-centralizing towards more of an organizational approach is on the agenda. And I would ask a sort of rhetorical question: do they actually, or would they actually want that? I think that's something interesting to consider. Either way has significant repercussions or implications for counterterrorism policy. On ISIS briefly, I think I agree very much that in certain areas of the world, ISIS has entered into a period of hibernation, which I think is the term that was used in the report. I would put that even further and say there are areas in the world where ISIS is clearly not claiming responsibility for its own actions, in part because it recognizes that Western counterterrorism assessments are largely based on monitoring ISIS claims of responsibility, not the actual attacks and operations and developments on the ground. And I, for one, can certainly say that in Syria and Iraq, we have fallen very, down the rabbit hole in that regard. We have tracked their claims, but not the wider scale of ISIS violence. So it's interesting that they've even embraced that approach, which is almost unprecedented, certainly from the ISIS perspective. Another sort of brief remark comparing AQ and ISIS. It's interesting that Al-Qaeda is often described, and I think rightly, more or less, as more of a kind of politically involved or politically aware terrorist organization. But it's ironic to an extent that in a situation where we find ourselves today with war in Gaza, it's ISIS that actually is benefiting more from a politically driven conflict than Al-Qaeda is. So Al-Qaeda all across on an official level on the internet through propaganda is speaking the political language of the Palestinian struggle and seeking to incite its supporters and its members around the world to take advantage of that. But it's ISIS who labels Hamas as apostates and says Hamas should be fought until the death and should be destroyed. It's ISIS that's benefiting from the war in Gaza. And of course, we've seen the attack just 24, 36 hours ago in Paris, arrests elsewhere in Europe. I'm told, although not public, several other plots foiled elsewhere in Europe as well over the last few weeks. So I think there's some sort of an irony there in terms of the interplay between politics and ideology and the fact that ISIS has managed to benefit more despite being less political. Very, very briefly, a couple bigger picture, 40,000 foot thoughts. One is just a fact. After 22 years of the war on terror, there are more terrorists today active in more countries around the world and with more territory under their control than ever before. So clearly we've got something wrong over the past 22 years. We haven't done a good job. We've watched the threat rise and expand. Western attention, which I think, Andrea, you were getting at in your report, is also very fickle. We are easily distracted. We're overly short-termist in our approach. We're far too tactical and far less strategic than we ought to be. I also think governments have celebrated, as we are still to this day, celebrating having degraded central leaderships, both of Al-Qaeda and of ISIS. But our governments fail to recognize that when we are also struggling against movements, which is something entirely different in terms of developing a counter strategy, and far more complex. And also, particularly sitting in America, the perception that we are safer at home than ever before, and that is a clear US assessment, overly encourages us to pivot our attention elsewhere. The idea that if terrorists are locally oriented and are growing roots on a local basis elsewhere in the world, somehow, particularly from an American perspective, means that they are not a concern, I think is misplaced and a big strategic misstep. And then finally on Europe, I totally agree. Europe is sort of the most vulnerable front for all kinds of events that are happening in the world, from the kind of black spot of Afghanistan, from Central Asia as a clear thoroughfare for events happening in and out of Afghanistan. Europe is very much on the radar. I was told a few months ago that there have been 3 active ISKP plots planned in Afghanistan, foiled in Europe already over the last 9 months. None of those were made public, but clear centralized planning from Afghanistan through Central Asia into Europe. I think that is not an insignificant thing. And we also need to be aware of simplistic narratives. We are challenging a very complicated array of different threats. And so a lot of the rhetoric coming around the October 7th attack and the subsequent war in Gaza associates challenges and threats posed by politically oriented terrorist groups like Hamas as being much the same as apocalyptic globalist threats and challenges posed by ISIS. If we think that treating these two things as one, contemporaneous case study with the same toolkit is going to lead to success in either case, we're kidding ourselves. And I do think as well that embracing that very simplistic black and white narrative no matter the threat or challenge we're looking at, is also a recipe for failure. And I don't think we've learned that lesson.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Let me turn to Emily. And Emily, when Andrea was presenting his report, he said a few minutes ago that these terrorist groups have used the media to show its power. I know you've thought a lot about that. I know you've written and thought a lot also about the Iran factor, which we've not talked about much. Love to get your reflections and reactions to the report. Any comments you have on those topics as well. Thanks, Emily.
Great. Thank you for having me. So the report spoke about the specific roles of extremist recruitment. And as you just mentioned, Brian, the messaging and leveraging of these platforms. And I want to go into that a little bit, just about the problem of the internet in open societies, in democracies, and how that intersects with those critiques. So first, as we all know, the internet is a breeding ground of extremist ideologies and movements. And that's not only hate speech when we're thinking about white supremacists, for example, but it's also messages and symbols, but not just in a way that you would think with the traditional propaganda, but actually in more coherent strategies of propaganda that employ techniques, such as videos with music accompanied to them. And I wrote about this in the Liberal Patriot, and those propaganda products are incredibly interesting and to potential recruits, terrorist recruits. And I mentioned that about Palestinian Islamic Jihad, specifically on Telegram. The other thing, we think about internet in open societies is that we're seeing potential recruits, people are actually looking for community, exposed to this array of terrorist movement ideas. So the potential recruit, and in this case, is able to pick and choose from particular components of ideologies, jihadist ideologies, ISIS, and anything else, and really picks up parts of those ideologies that speak to him. And this is called the salad bar effect. And that makes, when we're looking at, policing and targeting of these individuals, even proactively preventing a terrorist attack, very, very difficult, because we can't do it in the traditional way, which is based on ideology, full stop. And then again, in democratic societies with an open internet, and this is specifically with the US, platforms where terrorist recruiting occurs and radicalization occurs are protected from liability by Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. And so there is not an incentive to work comprehensively with governments, for example, to, again, identify the people who are susceptible to radicalization or in that process. And then finally, with Iran, and I'm happy to talk about this at length, we're seeing Iran and other state actors working to exacerbate the inbuilt tensions that we're seeing all over the world politically and in terms of identities and groups. And they're doing this, by muddying the waters, sowing distrust in institutions, and other tactics that are really, again, just a blow to democratic values and democracies, the world over.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Those are great thoughts. I'm going to turn lastly to Lorenzo for his opening comments. But before I do that, I want to pose the question that perhaps Andrea and the rest of the panel can consider for the next go around. And maybe Lorenzo can pick up on it too, because we've got about 20-25 minutes. And the question is, what do we do about this beyond the wake-up call? And this is a very good, useful wake-up call, this report, and everything that Andrea said. But then if we could start focusing the conversation a bit there. But before we do that on that question, Lorenzo, I know you've been examining the trends in extremism and terrorism for many, many years. You've seen it through different phases and episodes. And also you've talked quite a lot to Andrea and others about this topic. What would you add to this in terms of offering a more detailed, textured picture of what's going on in the world today?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for having me today. Yeah, very difficult task to come speak after the three great speakers, because a lot of the good points were already touched. I think Andrea's report does a phenomenal job at summing up a lot of the dynamics we've seen and a lot of the frustrations that I think people who are in the field, whether as analysts like ourselves or a lot of the practitioners have been experienced over the last few years, where attention seems to have dropped. Although I think, and I'll get to that, maybe the level of attention drop has been more acute in the US compared to Europe over the last few years. But obviously, Andrea does great work on that, and it's been a pleasure working with him over the last quite a few years on all the legislation he introduced in the Italian Parliament, and the work is done. The European aspect, I think, is very interesting, and there's no question that Europe is subjected to a lot of these dynamics. If I take a step back and look at it historically, Europe has seen different waves of jihadism. I mean, globally, we've seen that, but in Europe, we've always seen these waves. We've seen over the last 30 years, give or take, the presence of bubbles of sympathy, bubbles of support for the jihadist movement. But take different forms, they're different size, depending on the country we're looking at. But these bubbles have always existed and do exist right now. It's always external geopolitical events that determine the size and direction of these bubbles. Every time we see a big external event, then this movement grows in size and then also takes generally more aggressive posture. The latest of this series of events that starts arguably with the war in Bosnia in the 90s is, of course, the mobilization for Syria and Iraq, starting in 2011, 2012. We see the surge in Europe, the 5,000-6,000 Europeans who travel to Syria. And then, of course, we have seen the decline over the last few years. And I think, in a way, there's been this complacency in many places, maybe not at the practitioners level in Europe, but definitely in terms of the general public, thinking that the phenomenon is gone. I think most people have realized it's not gone. It's simply it's been in that phase of decline, but it's been physiological for the movement, the ebbs and flows that we have seen over the last 30, 40 years. So the question is October 7th that external geopolitical event that determines a resurgence, a growth in size, once again, of that bubble of sympathy that exists in Europe? I honestly think it's a bit premature to say. There's no question that we've seen a couple of incidents that we mentioned earlier, France, Belgium. Law enforcement intelligence agencies throughout Europe are extremely concerned about the growth of radicalization, of desire to carry out attacks. And as Charles was saying, this takes very different forms. It ranges from the very sophisticated, very externally planned attacks that ISIS-K and a couple of other groups have been planning over the last few months, which are unrelated and predate October 7th, but we can only grow with October 7th, with this probably competition that we are seeing among different groups to sort of become the leaders of the global jihadist movement. On some level, Hamas has taken the crown, even though it's not a global jihadist organization. There's no question that other groups want to show their relevance and show that right now, on some level, Hamas has become the most talked about group, and there's no question that the competition exists in that milieu. But it also takes the form, and statistically, this is what we have seen over the last 10 years. It mostly takes the forms of unaffiliated individuals, people who have only minimum affiliation with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Sometimes it's just simply that they make a declaration of affiliation, mostly with ISIS. Or in many cases, we've seen cases of attacks that are very difficult to call terrorist attacks. They're mostly actions of an individual, at times with mental health issues. He or she is a consumer of jihadist propaganda, but at the same time, a consumer of many other problematic ideologies, as sort of Emily was hinting at, this sort of salad bar extremism, suffers from mental health. So a combination of issues. And of course, the tension that we've seen, that has existed since October 7th, pushes some of these individuals from being keyboard jihadists or partial keyboard jihadists to actually mobilizing and doing something. I think if we ask ourselves the question as to whether October 7th is the new external geopolitical event that triggers a new uptick in jihadist activities, the one big difference I would see with the past is the fact that we don't have a destination. We don't have a sort of geographical center. In the past, every mobilization has had an external geographical component. People would go and travel to Syria, would go and travel to Chechnya, would go and travel to Afghanistan. Right now, there wouldn't be a place to travel. I don't really necessarily see people traveling to join Hamas or Hezbollah or any formation linked to the conflict that is taking place around Israel. The other places where the jihadist movement is active, the many other places that range from sub-Saharan Africa, which of course has become one of the most interesting places when it comes to global jihadism, to the Philippines, where we saw an attack just yesterday. None of these places has neither the emotional appeal nor the logistical ease that Syria had 10 years ago. It's unlikely that we're going to see a wave of people traveling to any of these places. As I said, it's a mix of emotional appeal and just a sheer difficulty of getting to these places. So that's the big difference. One can see this phenomenon, again, I don't have an answer to that, as a positive or a negative. A positive because then if you don't have a magnet, a place where people can go to, then the phenomenon can to some degree fizzle out. You can argue it's the opposite, because then people actually stay in Europe, in the West, and might actually only carry out attacks in Europe and the West. Is the perennial should I stay or should I go debate in foreign fighters that Thomas Hegghammer discussed a few years ago. And this would be the first time if we have a surge of radicalization without an outlet for that. So I don't have an answer to that. I would probably say, again, what I said at the beginning, that and which is very clear in Andrea's report, he's probably more critical with Europe. I'll take the opposite approach. Now, the criticism of Europe is very valid that Andrea makes of Europe always being sort of a bit parasitical in its approach to NATO. The criticism that I think it's fair to make about the US is the fact that it has largely dropped the ball, is what Charles was saying. It has lost interest, not entirely, of course, but it has lost a good part of its interest in the jihadist. It feels very outdated on this side of the pond. The idea that, well, if you're not directly attacking us now, then it's not of interest to us. Of course, was determined by a variety of factors, including, of course, domestically the surge of right-wing extremism in America. And we've been debating for a long time, or pushing the idea that it's not an either-or proposition. You can be facing a very severe right-wing threat in the US, which is undeniable, but it doesn't mean you have or can drop the ball on the other side. Let me close with three quick issues, two of which we already discussed, but are sort of the sticking points looking forward. Andrea talked about migration and the importance in a European setting of the migration phenomenon. Unquestionably, those two routes, the Balkans and North Africa, it is a very politically sensitive topic. It shapes elections in different ways in Europe. It's an easy argument for populist forces. I think it was quite wise the way Andrea, and he mentioned, Minniti, the former Minister of Interior in Italy, was, as a bona fide left-wing government in Italy, understood the challenge that came from migration and tried to find, and had quite some successes in trying to tackle the phenomenon in a humane but at the same time strong way. It's not lost on analysts that several terrorism incidents that we have seen over the last few years, including the one in Brussels, were carried out by individuals who came illegally to Lampedusa, carried out a process of radicalization in different European countries, were several times subjected to deportation decrees, which were never implemented, and then carried out attacks. The second point is the internet, which Emily discussed, the phenomenon of sort of salad bar extremism, which in the US has become very visible. The FBI talks about it, has come to Europe quite a bit as well, maybe with a couple of years delay. But we also have this phenomenon of individuals who adopt, pick and choose different elements of different ideologies, or simply endorse ultra-violence, school shootings, and a variety of other misguided worldviews, if you will, and put it all together. This on some level is as challenging and as problematic as the structured attacks with roots in groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The final thing is prisons. I would conclude with the issue of prisons, which is very, very important because we and the events in Paris over the weekend made it very painfully visible. We are now going to be facing a wave of people who are going to be released from prison in France in particular, because of the higher number, but also in many other European countries. These are the people who were sentenced in the glory days of ISIS, 2014, 15, 16. Some of them are the returnees. Here is the big difference between Europe and the US. Not only as the US has much smaller numbers, but the average sentence in the US tends to be 20 years and above for terrorism. In Europe, we have, even for people who are returnees, at times 1, 2, 3 years tops. In the case of Paris, the individual who carried out the attack Saturday in La Défense somebody was sentenced to 4 years for planning, near the Tour Eiffel was sentenced for 4 years for planning another attack in La Défense in Paris. So we are now going to have a wave of hundreds of individuals who are going to be released. Of course, some of them might be de-radicalized, whether through interventions by European governments and civil society to do de-radicalization, some on their own. But I think it's fair to say that quite a few people will not have de-radicalized and will be as, if not more, radical than when they were convicted. So these are the challenges. I think you wanted the solutions, but I think I ran out of time. So
yeah, no, it's fine. And we're running out of time. We've only got about 10 or 15 minutes. And those are great remarks. And the challenge with a discussion like this, with the time constraints of 60 minutes and such a great report from Andrea, is to cover it all and cover it deeply. But I think the breadth and the expansive nature of this discussion, I think, is the sort of thing that we need at a time when we get focused on the next phase in the operation that Israel's conducted in Gaza. We got to remember the big picture. If I had one question I'd ask Andrea, and then to the rest of you, and I'd put it this way, just because of the time constraints. Andrea, if the Prime Minister of Italy and her top security advisors came to you and said, we saw your report, we thought it was really interesting. We also saw towards the end where you talked about the law on the preventative fight against jihadist radicalization in Italy, the law that's not been approved. We'd like to do better. What would be the one thing that you think Italy and then Europe could do differently in terms of practical terms? And it's a similar question I'll ask to Charles, but more focused on the US and Emily as well. And Lorenzo, if you could bridge the divide or the gap, not the gap, but Europe and the US, because you have one foot in either. But if you could focus your question, if you were in the elevator, Charles, the answer to your question, Charles and Emily, with President Biden, and said, look, we've really lost the mark here in terms of our focus. What would be the one thing you'd suggest that he do differently in his policies? So let me turn to Andrea first for his response to that question.
Innanzitutto in Italia in questo momento la persona che si occupa di queste cose è il governo. Alfredo Mantovano è un ex magistrato che conosce la materia, una persona di grande buonsenso e intelligenza, e devo dire che su questo sta facendo una politica giusta. Cosa possiamo fare? Io anche sulle cose che diceva Emily e che diceva, diciamo, anche gli altri relatori, c'è un punto. La vera evoluzione negativa di questi anni è stata l'emergere di giovanissimi simpatizzanti che vivono nella jihadisfera. Per jihadisfera intendo internet, la rete. Questi giovanissimi, perché i militanti di Al-Qaeda della prima epoca in Afghanistan avevano intorno a 30 anni, erano molto islamizzati, avevano una cultura dell'Islam vera. Oggi siamo di fronte a ragazzi molto giovani, fra 15 e 25 anni, che spesso non hanno una vera e propria cultura islamica, ma risentono di questa effervescenza, di questa moda mediatica del jihadismo. Su questo la sola repressione non basta. La cosa che dobbiamo fare come NATO è una cosa per la quale io mi sono battuto quando ero il direttore del rapporto sul terrorismo jihadista dell'Assemblea della NATO. Creare uno standard operativo dei paesi della NATO che preveda repressione e prevenzione. La prevenzione è fondamentale. È fondamentale soprattutto per le giovani generazioni. La cosa che mi preoccupa è che dopo l'attacco di Hamas abbiamo assistito ad una crescita nella jihadisfera della simpatia di giovanissimi che simpatizzano per Hamas e che in qualche maniera non sappiamo quando e come potranno diventare una minaccia potenziale. Non le puoi mettere in prigione perché per ora non hanno fatto nulla se non simpatizzare, ma te ne devi occupare. Per questo è importante che i paesi della NATO abbiano un doppio registro legislativo, cosa per la quale io e Lorenzo ci siamo battuti in Italia. Una legge repressiva che colpisca chi fa un reato, ma anche un sistema preventivo che permetta di riportare sulla buona strada i giovani che vanno verso il jihadismo spesso per motivi molto diversi e per una immagine identitaria che può essere distorta. Questo secondo me è fondamentale, capire questo, che il nemico diventa meno minaccioso e meno silente se lo preveniamo. Non dobbiamo aspettare che scoppi il problema, bisogna prevenire.
Great. So that's a really clear idea. And I think given the challenges we're facing, as your report describes in the world, it would be good to reinvigorate that discussion in NATO about how to counter these trends. Just because of time and because we do want to close within about 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to turn to the other panelists with their responses to the question. Charles, if you were stuck in the elevator with President Biden, and again, on the bigger picture, on these questions of what could be done differently post, well, not post-ISIS, but you've done a lot of work on the continued challenges of Al-Hol and Al-ISIS. What would you say